Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks also a lot for the kind introduction, Till. I will be speaking today about two of my research areas that I've worked on in the past, gender wealth gaps on the one hand and wealth models, macro models of wealth on the other hand, and trying to get them under a common arch. And then I'll try to connect that and make that part of the arch, looking into the socio-ecological transition. That is a newer research field, and you will find that it's perhaps less unified and maybe a little bit more disparate than the first two. But to start off with, the gender wealth gap. In this field, we are faced with a key challenge that was discussed already on yesterday's panel, that data is very often, that we have a lack of data in gender research in general. And in wealth research, the issue is that data is generally collected at the household level for wealth only. In contrast to income in many instances, usually we have only household level data because the household is still a black box in wealth research. And the key source of data that we have in Europe, the Household Finance and Consumption Survey, the HFCS, which we'll encounter throughout the presentation today, is one of these instances. So in our first paper on the topic, we tried to get around this by looking at single adult female households. Here I show you their distribution over the net wealth distribution. So at the bottom you have the wealth deciles, lowest smoothed. And you can see that the share of female households on the y-axis is declining as we move towards the top, which shows you already the key point that this entire literature is making, that there are gaps, and we show this then also in a quantitative regression in this paper, that there are gaps in this case in gross wealth in assets after controlling for a host of other assets. So identical households of single adult females and single adult males have different levels in wealth, and these are not only statistically significant but economically. So the gaps for the 4 countries where we can ascertain them econometrically are between 27 and 48%. So identical female and male adult, single adult households have a quarter to half less, so the women have a quarter to a half less wealth. Now, we were looking at this in more detail for Austria in another paper with colleagues of mine. For the intra-couple wealth gap, Austria is one of the few countries within the HFCS which also asks then which share of this total wealth belongs to you personally, and therefore we are able then to divide the wealth between women and men. And what we see is that the gap increases towards the top, clearly. So you have here the percentiles for couples net wealth, and then the intra-household gender wealth gap in euros. But that is uneven, as you can also see, right? There are percentiles where there's a negative gap, where the woman owns more wealth, and especially towards the top, where there are substantial amounts of wealth held by households, the gap increases. And we also find in the econometric analysis in this paper that it can be explained by variables that we then interpret as approximating power within the couple. So that would be, for instance, differences in education, differences in age, differences in migration background. These help explain these gaps and render them then statistically insignificant, right? Because they're fully explained by these covariates. If you look at these variables that can be interpreted to denote power. What we did in the next step, in the next paper, was then check with a variable that actually captures decision-making power within couples. And again, here I show you the descriptive analysis instead of going into the econometrics. On the left-hand side, you have women's net wealth in 3 categories, households in which they state in which the responsible, the household respondent states that the woman has more decision-making power. Then the vast majority say they have joint decision-making power, and also that they have the same level of wealth. And then in sort of a copper, you have the no decision-making power, where the man has the decision-making power. And you can see on the right-hand side that for men, in both cases, wealth is correlated with having more decision-making power. So if the man has more decision-making power within the couple, they are also likely to have more wealth, but that only applies to the top, right? Starting the 75th percentile, but really at the 90th percentile is where we see that this gap starts to open. And this is what we perceive in all the gender wealth gap research, is that the gap is most noticeable, is most sizable at the top, where there really is a lot of wealth as well. I'm sure you're aware wealth is incredibly unequally distributed, much more unequally than income. And so the volume of wealth is really concentrated at the 90th and above percentile of these distributions in countries like in most high income countries, but especially in Germany, also the US and Austria. And so towards the top, you see that decision-making power leads to higher wealth of the person holding the decision-making power, but this effect is stronger for men. So this is again something that we see the patterns hold for both genders, but men, a stronger effect is stronger. Yes, and so then in riff regressions and decompositions, Kitagawa-Oaxaca-blind decompositions, we show that decision-making power can explain parts of the wealth gap, and especially at the top. So we are able to explain the gap through this decision-making power variable in couples. Now, as a quick sort of summary, the data collection, as I said, is often still at the household level. The household in wealth data is still a black box, even to this day and age, where you would have thought that feminist economics has really made inroads in opening this black box. But this is not true for wealth research, and we really need to go around and take the back alley in order to try to differentiate within the household. Men tend to have higher wealth levels on average, but this is driven really by the top of the distribution where there is a lot of wealth, and that then implies that gender wealth gaps are larger at the top of the distribution. This is where we can usually ascertain them econometrically. And we show that higher wealth, at least in Austria, is linked to decision-making power within the couple. And again, this is especially true for the top of the distribution, where we see that men who have decision-making power have substantially higher wealth. And now here we are entering the realm of speculation, but we hypothesize that this may point to a continued relevance of patriarchal norms. When there is wealth, the man owns it and he also has the decision-making power. And incidentally, this is often related to the ownership of business assets, to owning firms. Now, I'll be moving to the second part of the lecture, where I'm looking at macro models of wealth, another area of my research that I've worked on for some time. These are structural macro models following the work by Kaldor, Kalecki, and Pasinetti, and part of a spate really of recent literature on wealth models, starting with Paley, Kumar et al., Taylor, Peter Gentavani, Daniel, who can unfortunately not be here today. Özlem has worked in this area with co-authors. In our model, in several iterations, we have mixed income for both workers and capitalists. There's wealth accumulation through savings, so an endogenous feedback on growth through the endogenous wealth distribution. Firms invest and produce. We include differential saving rates and differential rates of return that are defined through the portfolio composition. And we calibrate the model to wealth and consumption survey data in the first paper, with the wealth share of capitalist C as our key distributional measure, outcome measure, and 6 parameters of the differential saving rates, the typical post-Keynesian differential saving rates, the profit share, the share in labor income, and the profit-generating wealth share as a nod to the Marxist literature in this area. Now, this is really just to show you this is a standard post-Keynesian model in the Kalecki-Steindl tradition, where income is divided between the wage bill and total income for capitalists and workers. And they are sort of the inverse of each other. So you have the labor share of capitalists and one minus the labor share of workers, and the same for the profit-generating share in assets for the total capital income. We have a standard Kalecki-Steindl model, also in terms of the investment function, and consumption consists takes place out of income subject to a saving rate. And as you see in the basic version of the model, the equilibrium is rather simple. It's a tractable standard post-Keynesian macroeconomic model, where the relative saving rates and the profit share determine the equilibrium value of the capitalist share in wealth, and that is wealth inequality as we measure it in the model. Now, empirically, we compare this to the estimated distribution, again, from HFCS data. In the blue bars, you see for a number of European countries how the wealth inequality was empirically, and then the estimated model effects of this wealth share of the capitalists. Now, I wouldn't put too much store on the precise numbers here. The key point that we were making with this paper was first, this is stable. So even endogenizing the wealth share yields stable outcomes and doesn't necessarily, at least, lead to an explosion or implosion of the model. And for the point of this presentation here, what is important is that the wealth inequality is predicted by the model to rise further in every single country. In some countries minimally, but essentially it's increasing. We then use this model to investigate other aspects, such as aggregate demand, showing that with an exogenous profit rate, by endogenizing the wealth share, you make the demand regimes more wage-led, which can potentially then even lead to a regime shift from a profit-led to a wage-led wage accumulation regime. And we also looked at the dynamics of the adjustment process. Most recently, we worked on a paper that endogenizes the profit rate, and this now relates to the point of the lecture here. Because first of all, you do see that at the top left, the wealth share continues to increase. So after a transition period, again, this key point that wealth inequality is going to wealth share of capitalists always, and therefore wealth inequality is going to rise in this model in this post-Keynesian model of wealth inequality. And on the bottom left, and that is the key point here now, the growth rate is minimally affected, right? So again, as Özlem Onaran already said yesterday evening, these models have small effects on growth, and therefore also from the wealth inequality, there is no, so our model reproduces the very small effects of growth on growth that are typical for these types of models. And from a climate point of view, there is no negative feedback effect of this increasing wealth inequality, which I do believe is at least we can say that it's likely to remain very high, but there will be no attenuating effect on growth that might help us with the climate issue. That is sort of the key point here. These models do not lead us to expect to expect substantial attenuating effects on growth from increasing wealth inequality. So, as a conclusion for this second part of this presentation, first of all, you can criticize our model on many counts, and it has rightly been done so, but I do think it captures one aspect of reality in that wealth inequality is likely to rise further, or as a minimum sort of fallback position, it is likely to remain very high. And I think that tallies very well with the empirical data, which is really not capable of measuring differences in wealth inequality, because we have such poor survey data that is very bad at capturing the very top of the distribution. So I think extremely high wealth inequality, which even with this data we are able to measure, is likely to remain high or even increase further, as our model predicts. Now, a second point that we made was that growth regimes are likely to become more wage-led and equivalently less profit-led if the profit rate is exogenous. However, with an endogenous profit rate, higher wealth concentration will reduce growth, but for the purpose of a socio-ecological transition, not substantially. So there will be minimal effects on growth, and they will not help very much with the socio-ecological transition. That is perfect, thank you. Right, so now for the last part of this presentation, I'll be presenting two separate works. You'll see the art is not quite as clear as for the first ones. First, we'll be talking about wealth inequality and emissions, and secondly about social norms, because I do believe that this is where, as Lem already did, and also then Elson did yesterday, tying in the question of patriarchy and of social norms with the socio-ecological transition is crucial, as we also discussed yesterday after the plenary session. So the second part of this third part will be looking at how life events affect hours spent on unpleasant household tasks for women and men. So to start off with, we continue with the Germany-centered focus of these presentations, and I do apologize for that. But following work from Chazelle and Miriam Rehm, we looked at the distribution of emissions by wealth. And you can see how extremely unequally this is distributed. You have net wealth in 0.1 percentiles, so in a thousandth of net wealth on the bottom axis. And on the y-axis, you have emissions in tons. And you can see how extremely concentrated CO2 emissions in Germany are. And this is true for virtually all, for most countries, right? Again, this is a data issue. We very rarely have very good wealth data. The SEP here is that we're using here is one of the best sources for Germany. We argue even better than the HFCS. And this extreme concentration is mainly due to the ownership of business assets of firms, right? And so linking this to the gender wealth gap, of course, at the top of the wealth distribution, that is more male than female, as that literature shows, and where there is a lot of wealth, that is the part of the wealth distribution that benefits the most from emissions, from CO2 emissions, or formulated differently, is responsible for the by far largest share of CO2 emissions in Germany. Now, so that is the one tie to the socio-ecological transition, and the other one is now this question of social norms and how persistent they are. Here we use, again, SEP data. It was discussed, I can only repeat, it was already, the issues were already pointed out yesterday. Here we see them in action. We have time use data from the SEP again, which is very problematic and very poorly measured. And even with this data, what we see is that hours worked on unpleasant household tasks, such as daily cooking, daily shopping, things like shopping for necessities, after cohabitation, so after a couple moves in together, women and men move in together, increases substantially. Now, this is a life event study. We're using a probabilistic estimator. We can discuss all of that in detail later if you want to. But if you look at time zero, the moment when couples move together, you can see that women substantially increase their work in the household on these unpleasant tasks, as do men in the first year, right? And then it goes right back to where it was. So it's rather short-lived that the effect for men that we observe, at least in this data. Now, birth, as I'm sure all of you know from sort of anecdotal experience, the household work after birth increases substantially for women after the first birth, after this life event. Whereas for men, we actually find it decreases, which goes beyond the literature, which usually finds no effect on men. So after the first birth of a child, on average, of course, women work substantially more while men work less, rather than maybe helping with these unpleasant tasks. We're excluding childcare here, right? So this is really just sort of the tedious housework. So then we had we asked ourselves, what then happens after divorce, right? You would assume. And in fact, the effects do reverse. So women are able to reduce their work on these unpleasant tasks, whereas men go back to pulling their own weight and working more after divorce. Although not fully. They do reverse, but not fully the effects. So, as a last content slide, there are just flashlights on this on further research that I've done that sort of relates to the socio-ecological transition. If you look not at the richest, but at the poorest, at the bottom end, we find in causal, but what I really believe is the correlations that we see in this work, that energy poverty has negative effects on health, right? So again, in Germany, but this is something that holds really, was originally developed for low-income countries and has sort of trickled down towards high-income countries. But even for Germany, we see that energy poverty, on top of, after controlling for income poverty, leads to worse health outcomes. And given the energy price shocks that we've seen, I do believe that this is extremely pertinent. Now, looking at the social norms, and what we also find is that unexpected childcare burdens fall mainly on women. We were looking at the COVID school closures there and showing that women reduced their paid work hours substantially more than men in Austria. In very sort of recent work that is still in the process of being developed, we're looking at more traditional gender attitudes in Germany and how they are linked to lower concerns about the climate. I think this speaks very much to current political trends in both the US and also in Germany and other countries. How this anti-emancipation movement is very much linked to the anti-climate movement and then to other political aspects that I personally find very concerning. And the last paper that I wanted to mention here is where we show, again, work that is very much underway in export-oriented growth models, that they have different effects by gender and race. And that is sort of the last bit of the intersectionality that I was able to salvage from my initial promise. All right, so to conclude, wealth inequality is gendered. That is something that I firmly believe, not across the vast majority of the distribution, because there is barely any wealth across the vast majority of the distribution in high-income countries, but at the top of the distribution, where there is wealth, we do see that that this top is more male than female, that there is a gender wealth gap. The second point that I hope you will take from today is that wealth inequality is likely to remain high or even rise further if you believe our model, with little to no attenuating effects on growth. And at the same time, a very large share of CO2 emissions are generated by the top of the wealth distribution. And again, I think that is a very stable finding. This extremely unequal wealth distribution with an even more unequal CO2 emission I believe is rather solid. And that implies, taken together, that the direct effect of wealth inequality is very large, and the potential sort of beneficial effect that on growth that might take place is most likely to be very irrelevant, unfortunately. Well, depending on your views. And the third point, and that is sort of a little bit more speculative than the first two, I do believe that socio-ecological transition will require a focus on green and purple jobs, as Miriam calls them, and a redistribution of work and care time. But what I do see in my research so far, and I'm sure you all sort of have a gut feeling about this, traditional gender norms are incredibly persistent. What we can have shown is that decision-making power within couples is linked to higher wealth, especially for men at the top. So where it matters, the hand is on the wealth. of men. And the second sort of nugget of support for this hypothesis that I was able to give you is that unpleasant household tasks are performed more often by women in couples after life events. So thank you very much for your attention.